about Lincoln and about Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He was born on a plantation in Maryland. He escaped from slavery at one point and became the leading abolitionist in America. In fact, he was the first great Black national leader in America. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. So he worked very hard to free other Black folk that were enslaved in the South. And he was a great speaker. He was an orator. And he founded a newspaper, the North Star, and he lived in Rochester, New York. And Frederick Douglass educated himself. He educated himself through reading, and he was concerned about freeing Black folk. He was concerned about freeing the enslaved people. So he worked with another group of people, other abolitionists, to free the slaves in the South. And he became a leading spokesperson and became really an ally of Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln depended on Frederick Douglass for a lot of advice. So Frederick Douglass really represents an example of the first major national leader that was working for civil rights and social justice in America. Frederick Douglass was able to help free the slaves. He was able to provide education for a number of people throughout his life. And he was an author. He wrote books, and he spoke all over the world, especially in Europe and in this country. And once he was free, he worked very hard to bring about a change of circumstances in this country. So my message to all of you this morning is to read as much as you can. Try to make sure that you do your best in all of your classes, because as I was taught years and years ago, reading is so fundamental. So try to read and try to get a great sense of what's happening in the country. And as a young person in elementary school, I became involved in all of the school activities. I was my class president in high school, and as Chris pointed out, I was president of my student council at my high school, and I went on to college at Russ College in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and I was my class president for 3 years, and I was president of the Student Government Association my senior year in college. And I got involved in helping people to register to vote. And I was one of 3 individuals that voted in my home county back in 1962. It is reported that the 3 of us were the first African Americans to register and vote in DeSoto County in modern history, because prior to the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, very few Black folk were registered to vote in Mississippi or in most other places in the South, because in order to register in Mississippi prior to 1965, you had to fill out a literacy test. You had to fill out this form with 24 questions on it. And the questions were very subjective. That is, the answers were determined by the registrar, the person who was administering the test. And the big question that was most difficult for most citizens taking the test was you had to explain or interpret a section of the Mississippi Constitution to the satisfaction of the person giving you the test. and that person was called the registrar. The office is now the office of the circuit clerk in Mississippi, and that person is also the registrar of voters. And if that person didn't like you or didn't like your response, then you were really not a registered voter. So it took a lot of people a number of years to get registered, and some people didn't ever get registered until the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, and that act enabled Black folk to register and to vote in the South because it got rid of that test that required you to answer all of those questions. And so as a young college student, I got involved in helping people to register to vote, in addition to helping to organize the boycott of the theater in Holly Springs, Mississippi. And as Chris pointed out, I was one of the founding members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And that Freedom Party was a party that challenged the regular Democratic Party in Mississippi. And prior to 1964, and during 64, the regular Democratic Party in Mississippi was all white, it was segregated, and it didn't have any Blacks at all in the party, and very few women. And very few women, I mean, in this case, white women, because the party was primarily controlled by white men who believed in segregation. And we challenged that party. We went to Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1964, and the Freedom Democratic Party was an integrated party. We had both Blacks and whites in our party. And we went to the convention, the National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and we made the case that we should represent Mississippi and not the segregated party that was all white. And we didn't quite win the case in 1964, but 4 years later, in 1968, when we went to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and we went there, and the name was the Loyalist Democrats. The Loyalist Democrats were able to prevail. They were recognized as the legitimate, bona fide Democratic Party in Mississippi. But I want to point out very quickly before I conclude is that in 1964, at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, a lady by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer from Ruleville, Mississippi, gave testimony at the convention. And she talked about what had happened to her when she lived on the Marlowe plantation in Sunflower County, Mississippi, how she had been evicted from the plantation. She had been put off the plantation because she tried to register to vote. And the person that she was working for, the plantation owner, W.D. Marlowe III, asked her to remove her name from the books, and she refused to. And she had to leave the plantation. And at that national convention in 1964 in Atlantic City, she talked about how she had been evicted or thrown off the plantation. She also talked about in 1963, coming back from a voter registration meeting in Charleston, South Carolina, Mrs. Hamer and several people went into the white-only side of the bus station in Winona, Mississippi, and they were jailed, and she was beaten because they tried to get a cup of coffee or order a hamburger on the white-only side of the bus station. Because at that time in 1963, that was what they call a colored side that was for Black folk and a white side for white people. And they went into the white side. And that's why she and other people were arrested, and in jail they were beaten because they were trying to get and order a hamburger and a cup of coffee on the white side of the bus station. So civil rights, social justice, trying to improve your community is something that I started out trying to do as a very young person. And I tell you that I gained more knowledge about things going on in the world through reading, because reading was so important to me. And just before I conclude, the other subject that I really liked was geography, because geography, you could look at activities, you could look at countries, you could study countries all over the world. And one of the great things about reading is that reading can take you any place in the universe. So although you may be in West Point now, or Starkville, or wherever, or Walls where I am, but reading can take you to Italy, it can take you to Africa, it can take you any place in the world. So young boys and girls, please read. Read as much as you can, and read something every day. Every day, read something every day. So this idea of equality, people working together, civil rights, it is important because we need to, as a people, help to make our society a better place for all us to live. And I hope and trust that all of you will pursue professions, become medical doctors, engineers, lawyers, and teachers. Please think about your favorite teacher and try to emulate your favorite teacher, so one day you will become a teacher and a principal, and you can help educate other young girls and boys. So Chris, let me stop. I think I've gone on a bit too long anyway.
That was fantastic, Dr. McLemore. Thank you very much. For my teacher friends, if you guys want to, if any of your students, if you have any questions, please tell your teachers that, and then we'll put them in the chat. Dr. McLemore, I have a question for you myself, if that's okay with you.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the importance of finding Frederick Douglass and reading some of his writings and learning about his teachings. Do you think that's influenced how you went ahead even after the movement and your career later on in life?
Yes, Frederick Douglass really influenced me as the person that I tried to emulate. You know, I started with Lincoln, and through Lincoln, I met Frederick Douglass. And the thing that impressed me about both President Lincoln and Mr. Douglass was that Lincoln loved to read. He had to read by candlelight, or he read by the fireplace, because, of course, boys and girls, they didn't have electricity when Mr. Lincoln was a boy. And Frederick Douglass did the same thing. He read by candlelight. And in the case of Mr. Douglass, Chris, you probably know that during that time, it was against the law to teach slaves how to read. But it turns out that the plantation owner's wife, where Mr. Douglass lived, taught Frederick Douglass how to read. And from that very beginning, that early start of teaching Mr. Douglass how to read, he used that basically to educate himself. And so I was really inspired by these two men, one becoming a president later, and one later becoming a national leader, an abolitionist. But the common denominator between both of them was the love of reading, and how reading expanded their knowledge, and how reading helped Mr. Douglass fight for social justice in America. So he really inspired me, along with the inspiration, quite frankly, Chris, that I got from my grandfather, Leslie Williams, who was a landowner here in the town of Walls. He also inspired me. He only had a 4th grade education. He referred to himself as a 4th grade scholar, but he used that 4th grade scholarship to become a businessman, a landowner, and a leader in the town of Walls. So I got both that inspiration from Mr. Douglass and from my grandfather, Leslie Williams.
That's fantastic. And a lot of our friends on this call actually are in fourth grade. So that's cool to keep in mind as well. One of our friends, Mr. Jace here, has an important question for you that might take a minute to answer. That's, what's your favorite book of all time?
My favorite book of all time, I really have two books. One is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And James Baldwin was an important writer, important thinker in America. James Baldwin was like Mr. Douglas and President Lincoln. He didn't actually formally go to college, but he graduated high school and he taught himself, and he became one of our greatest writers. So The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And growing up, I started to read Richard Wright, a Mississippi author born in Natchez, Mississippi. And he wrote a book called Black Boy. And Black Boy is another one of my favorite books. And I was inspired by Richard Wright because Richard Wright, like James Baldwin, Richard Wright didn't formally attend college. He graduated from elementary school in Jackson and really didn't have the formal education of so many of us, but he also taught himself, to read. He was very much involved with learning, and he also developed this love of reading. And from that reading, he taught himself to write. So both Baldwin and Richard Wright taught themselves how to write, and they became some of the greatest authors that this country has produced. So again, I keep going back to this reading and writing because my heroes were people who really loved to read, and then they really learned to write too, because both Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Douglas were authors. And of course, obviously, Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Wright were renowned authors in this country and received worldwide recognition.
Awesome. So something about your story that strikes me is you were educated in high school and up to your undergrad in Mississippi, and then you went north for your master's and your PhD. You did some work at Johns Hopkins and other really, really important, great institutions. What inspired you to come back down to Mississippi to begin working over at Jackson State University?
Well, I actually, once I graduated Rush College, I went off to Atlanta University and got a master's degree. So that was in Georgia. And then I left and went to Massachusetts, to the University of Massachusetts, where I got my doctorate in political science or government. But the idea as a young person growing up in Mississippi and working in civil rights, becoming a part of the civil rights movement, I was inspired enough to want to help change the conditions in Mississippi. And I fully understood even when I was in elementary school and high school, that voting was important. So I returned to Mississippi after receiving my education because I wanted to be a part of the change agents in Mississippi. So I have worked. I ran for public office because I wanted to change the conditions in Jackson and in Mississippi. I returned to my hometown here in Walls, and I ran for the Walls Board of Aldermen, where I serve now, because I wanted to have an impact on my community. So the inspiration early on just simply stayed with me. When I left to get an education outside of Mississippi, because when I pursued my PhD, I couldn't get a PhD in Mississippi because of the color of my skin. I couldn't go to Mississippi State or Ole Miss to get a doctorate. So I had to go out of state. So when I went out of state, I returned with the idea is that I wanted to have an impact on my community. I wanted to try to help change things in our state. So I'm here because I love Mississippi, and I want to see us become the very best state in the country, a state where Black folk and white people are working together to make this a much better society for everybody.
That's incredible. Thank you. We actually have 2 questions from our friends. What's our first question, Rachel?
Madison is asking Dr. McLemore, how is school different today from when you went to school?
When I went to school back in the 40s and 50s, when I grew up in Walls, we had school for Black folk essentially about 5 months out of the year, because if you lived in Walls, you had to work in the fields. And we had cotton in Walls. So you had to chop cotton during the cotton chopping season, and you had to pick cotton during the harvesting season, the picking of cotton. So I didn't have a lot of months in school. It was only when I attended school in Memphis, Tennessee, that I went to school for 9 months. But ordinarily, and I did most of my schooling in Mississippi until I was in high school. I didn't attend school but only 5 months out of the year. And I started school in a 1-room church in Walls, Mississippi. And then when I graduated elementary school, I was attending school in a 2-room school with 2 teachers, grades 1 through 8. And when I got to high school, I had several teachers. And then the high school consisted of 3 churches in a 2-room school building. That was the Hernando Central High School in Hernando, Mississippi, until my very junior year. So we had none of the technology that we have now, but we had dedicated teachers. And of course, I had a strong desire to learn, because again, at the center point of my education was reading and teaching myself. And I would always raise questions about things that I did not understand, and I would ask my teacher to explain to me. So education now, acquiring education is easier from the standpoint is that you have so many things available to help you. We didn't have the technology that the young people have now.
Awesome. And what's our second question there, Rachel?
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions. You're inspiring students to ask questions today, Dr. McLemore, which is good.
Good.
One of our friends, Timothy Chandler, asked, have you ever met anyone famous during the civil rights movement? I'd argue you're famous in the civil rights movement, but maybe some of our scholars only know a few names. Who are some of your most famous colleagues during the movement?
Well, in addition to Mrs. Hamer that I mentioned, let me also point out, young people, I really wish your teachers would Google, and y'all would Google Fannie Lou Hamer, because like my grandfather Leslie Williams and like Richard Wright, Mrs. Hamer didn't graduate high school, but she taught herself to read. She was very much attached to education, was very much a part of what she was about. But during the civil rights movement, I met Mrs. Hamer, another famous lady, Mrs. Annie Devine, who was a civil rights leader and civil rights worker who ran for the U.S. Congress in Mississippi. I met Victoria Gray Adams, who was also very famous. And I wish at some point during the course of the school year that the young people would Google Annie Devine, D-E-V-I-N-E, and would Google Victoria Gray Adams, and would Google Fannie Lou Hamer, and would Google Bob Moses, who was the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So teachers, please have your young people to learn something about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Have them to learn something about the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Have them to learn something about CORE, C-O-R-E, the Congress of Racial Equality, C-O-R-E, CORE, and have them to learn something about SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Google SCLC. So I met during my civil rights days, I met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I met his wife, Mrs. Coretta Scott King. I met another famous lady by the name of Ella Baker. And teachers, please Google Ella Baker. Ella Baker was one of the leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Ella Baker was a leader in the NAACP, and she was a leader in the SCLC, and she was the founding mother of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I met Dr. Aaron Henry, who was on the screen now. Dr. Aaron Henry ran for governor on the Freedom Vote campaign in 1963. And along with him, the white man standing with the collar around his neck is the Reverend Ed King, who was the chaplain at Tougaloo College when they ran for the U.S., when they ran for governor of Mississippi. And then Lawrence Guyot on the right side, who was the chairman of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He was a graduate of Tougaloo College. And then you have the scene at the top of Mrs. Hamer, Mrs. Gray, and Mrs. Devine in Washington, D.C., and a picture of the gathering of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And in the forefront of the picture, you have Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses. Dr. Moses was the leader, again, of SNCC in Mississippi. So I had the opportunity to meet a lot of outstanding civil rights leaders, including the person who was the executive director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Roy Wilkins. And then I met Medgar Evers, who was the leader of the NAACP in Mississippi. I met just a number of outstanding individuals that influenced me and people that I work with. So I was very fortunate. Between 1960 and 1964, I met some of the major leaders in the civil rights movement in America.
That's amazing. We have one last question we're going to ask for you, Dr. McLemore. Thank you so much for taking your time out for us. And Rachel, do you mind reading out the question for us?
Yeah, of course. I just want to mention we've got teachers saying, thank you for listing those names. They've pulled them up and look forward to learning more about them. And I was able to pull up that slide because we do a whole session, about Freedom Summer and all of those leaders. So we're trying to do the work here too, Dr. McLemore. But we've got one last question here from a student, which I think sums up what your message is what do you think kids can do to change their communities and the world?
Number one, kids can get involved, because one of the things that I did early on is that I got involved in all of the school organizations. I was involved in my church. So if you from a family where you go to church, I was involved in my church. And I got involved in Sunday school. I got involved in making speeches because my mother and my grandmother required, my brother Eugene and I, they required that we would give speeches on special occasions at church, whether it was Children's Day, Mother's Day, or Easter, whatever, the 4th of July, whatever it was, we were involved in giving speeches. And I was involved in the Walls Chapel CME Church. And as a young person, I had a speech impediment. I used to stutter. And the speech making really helped me overcome my stutter. And I didn't talk a lot, quietly in public. But once I overcame my stutter, they couldn't shut me up. So I tell you, it is important for you to really participate in organizations. So if there are school clubs, get involved in the clubs, because leadership is important. One of the things I talked about constantly was reading. And then one of the constants in the lives of all the people that I mentioned is that they were leaders. They were leaders early on. And young people, you don't become a leader overnight. Abraham Lincoln started to read early. He was involved in his community. Frederick Douglass, as a slave, was very much involved in his life on that plantation. But so he learned to read early on and was taught by the plantation mistress. But it is important that you read, because there's an old adage that says, readers make leaders. So if you want to be a leader in your community, read and get involved in the organizations in your school, in your community, and that involvement will stay with you the rest of your life. Because again, leaders are not produced overnight. It takes time and you have to work at it. So please Google some of those names that I mentioned, because those people were young like you are, and at one day they became leaders, not only in their communities, but became worldwide leaders. And from where you are now, you can one day become a leader in this country or a leader in this world. Because out of the group that's listening to me this morning, I'm sure somebody one day will be governor of Mississippi or a US senator from Mississippi or some other place. So the sky is the limit, but it starts with reading and preparing yourself to become a leader.
Sorry about that, we were muted. Dr. McLemore, thank you so much for your time. For our students and teacher friends, if you guys want to give Dr. McLemore a quick round of applause for us. I hope you guys were as inspired as I was. It was just an incredible time. Thank you, Dr. McLemore. And
you're welcome.
For our teachers and students, that's about it. It's going to wrap up our time with Dr. McLemore, and thank you guys so much.
Anyone have anything to say? You want to unmute, or we will end our session now, and hope y'all have a great day.
Thank you so much. We enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. McLemore, if you want to hang out for just a second for us when we all head out, we can debrief for a split second.
I just let Pam in the room too, so she can see. All right, hope y'all have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.